In this video, we're going to be breaking down the repeating group element. Repeating groups are used to display lists, and your list can come from a number of different data sources. More often than not, the data source is going to be your own app's database, but you can also populate these lists with plugins, API connections, or even custom states. Take a look at an example of a repeating group design that we have here on this page. This is set up to display a list of users from our database. So if I go to the preview here, we can see this is a single column with multiple rows for each of my users. Now, a repeating group is really made up of cells. Okay, so for every item in my list, that is going to generate a new cell in my repeating group. But cells can be organized into any combination of rows and columns that you'd like. You can set the rows and columns to be fully fixed so that it's always a specific set number of rows and columns, or you can set either one of these to be dynamic. So in my case, what I have here in this configuration is I want a fixed single column. I don't want it to go to two columns. But I have dynamic number of rows as long as my rows are at least 100 pixels tall. Okay, so however many users are in my database, that's how many rows essentially that bubble will create. Okay, now if I change my columns to, let's say 2, I'm still going to have the same number of cells, right? The same number of items in my list. My data source hasn't changed. I've just changed my layout style. Right? I'm displaying it in less rows but more columns. So I'm just going to refresh the page here, so that I can see the same number of cells in a different row and column structure. And Bubble will populate the list from left to right, top to bottom, when you're sorting things, just so that you can keep that in mind. Okay. Now, in this particular repeating group, we're working with users from our database. Okay, so I'm searching for users. I actually have a constraint on here so that it only shows me users where the photo isn't empty. And I do have control over paging through this list. Let's say that I had hundreds of thousands of users. I don't want, all of those users to generate immediately. That could, really affect the performance of the page. You could actually crash the page with that number of items. So you have a few different ways to control how many items in a list you see at one time. And that's really going to be dictated by your layout style as well. So I could either create a paging system where I fix the number of rows and columns and use workflows to go to the next set of, however many there are. So for example, if I had fixed this to one column and 2 rows only, right, I'm only going to see 2 people at a time. But I know that I have more than that, and I want the user to be able to move to the next page of 2. So what I can do from here, let me actually change my layout style of this group real quick. Let's change this to a column format. And that way I can add a button below my repeating group here. So I can have, previous and next buttons like this. Okay, previous and next. And so for these 2 buttons, I'm going to put these inside of a row container. That way they stack inside of my group. Let's do that kind of layout style, center, and let's remove the fit width to content. All right, that's close enough for right now. Right, so this is going to be below my repeating group, and when I click on this next button, I'm going to trigger an action to show the next page of this fixed row and column layout repeating group. Element action under repeating group, we have a few of them here. So I'll show next, and I'm going to select my repeating group user, and it's just going to go to the next set of 2. Now let's say I'm on the last page of 2. I can wrap around so that it goes back to the beginning if I want. I'm going to copy this. I'm just right-clicking that and just going to paste this here. So I have a duplicate and switch this over to my previous button and swap out this action so that we show the previous set of 2. And I do need to select my repeating group again. All right, so let's take a look at what that gives us just to show you one way to page through your users. We're also going to have another way to scroll through our users if that's the design that we're going for. So here I only see Rachel and Joey, no one else. If I click next, then it's going to page through to the next page. Now we see Ross and Monica, then Chandler and Phoebe. So here I've reached the end of the list. If I click on next, I don't have any more users that meets my data source constraints. So Bubble actually has a few different states available to me at the repeating group level to know when I'm on the last page or to know what page I'm on, so I can create conditions around these buttons and say, hey, if we're on the last page, hide this button so that I don't confuse the user. So just to show you where that's at, I'm going to go to this next button here and add a condition. And if I reference the repeating group, so we'll locate that element, repeating group user, these are all the states, the built-in states that Bubble has for a repeating group in general. I can access the repeating group's list of users. So if I wanted to display their names somewhere else, I can show that in a text element away from the repeating group. I can know whether the repeating group is still loading its content or not. This is a yes or no value. I can know what page I'm currently on. This would just result in a number. And then these are also yes or no values. It'll tell me if it is on the first page or not, or if it's on the last page or not. So for example, this button, I can say, if it's on the last page, we hide it, right? I turn off the visibility. Whereas this previous button, I can say, if the repeating group's user is on the first page, then I also hide it, right? Because there's nothing to go back to. And I can add another text element inside of this group here to display the repeating group's page number, right? So I can see which page I'm actually on, all right? So let's refresh the page just so we can see that kind of capability. There we go. You can see that we start off on page 1. I can, of course, also type in the text page, so it says page 1. And then if I click next, now we're on page 2, next, and you see how that next button went away? Click previous, that previous button goes away because those conditions are passing. I can even see this in my debugger. If I go to inspect and search for my previous button, it tells me that it's invisible. It also shows me in green here that this condition is passing. The repeating group is on the first page. If I evaluate this expression, this condition here, especially on that piece, that evaluated text there, it's telling me, yes, this is true, right? It is on the first page. If I move over to the next page, okay, and go back to the previous button, let me just reselect it. Okay, you see now the condition's not passing because no, this is false. It is no longer on the first page, and so the condition doesn't pass. Therefore, we do see this button here. Okay, now another way that you can page through is to actually scroll through your content. This is going to require you to change the setting of both your rows and columns, but also the parent container of the repeating group, right? It's going to be important to put the repeating group inside of a regular group. So what I'm going to do here is unfix the number of rows. I want that to be dynamic. Again, I want a minimum of 100 pixels in height for my cells. Okay, so I could change this to 50 to make them even smaller. I'm going to have to change my group that's in here. Let's modify this. Let's see, this has a minimum height of 66. So I'm going to remove that. See if we have any other minimum heights set to anything. Our image is probably here. Let's do it this way. I'm probably gonna have to make more changes in order to show you this getting compressed more, but it's all being dictated by the elements inside that have specific heights. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction here actually. In the repeating group, I'm going to set the minimum height to 200 just to show you, right? This is now forcing the height of the cell to be much taller because that's my minimum, but it's still a dynamic number of rows. I don't know how many rows are going to be generated. It's just dependent on my data source. If I have 10 users, it's going to show 10 cells, 10 rows in this case because I only have one column. All right, so I'm going to bring this back down so it's a little bit more compressed. And let's see here. Okay, so now that I've made the rows dynamic, the parent group of this repeating group has a setting under the Layout tab to allow vertical scrolling when content overflows. Okay, and I'm also going to not fit the height of this group to content. I want it to be a height that is in place. It doesn't expand, all right? But if the content inside is such that it would expand otherwise, we're going to have the group scroll. We'll create a scroll bar with this setting. Okay, so I'm going to refresh the page here so that we can see that behavior. And because we have dynamic rows here, we don't need to work with that next and previous buttons anymore. In fact, we wouldn't be able to because Bubble doesn't know how many, the concept of pages doesn't really exist anymore because of that setting. Let's see, we missed something here. Let's go back to, we might need to set, yes, we might need to fix our height. There's the height of this is completely responsive. We do want to leave this unchecked, but I don't have any other indication of what the height should be. So I'm going to give this a height of, let's say 300 pixels, right? So we kind of see a little bit more than 2 cells at a time just to really show this behavior of the scrolling. So this means that the group will always be at 300, but we know that there's going to be more than 3 rows, so it's going to create a scrolling effect here for us. There we go. All right, so we see the scroll bar now showed up, and we can scroll through a certain number at a time just based on the height of that group. Again, in this case, we wouldn't have those next and previous buttons because they don't apply here anymore. We don't have that concept of pages anymore. In fact, this value, this state is no longer available to us. All of those states, the page number, the ones that we were using in the conditions for if we're on the first page or the last page, that whole paging concept does not exist because the repeating group has a dynamic number of rows and we're just scrolling through them. So at this point, I would actually just delete this group with those buttons like that. Okay, now I want to take you through a couple of real world examples where, when I look at those designs, I would say, hey, if I were replicating this, I would be using a repeating group for it. So if we jump over to Indeed, for example, anywhere that you see a list of something is a good indicator that you use a repeating group for it. So if I were to redesign this in Bubble, this is a thing that jumps out at me immediately for repeating group, right? Consider that I have a data type in my database called search query or search terms, and I'm keeping track of all the different searches that people are doing on my site and and how many times that is being searched. So my data source can be set up to find the first 10. If I were to sort them by their count, I show the first 10, that gives me the top 10 searches, and display them in a repeating group here, then I'm instantly creating this design. I do not have to create 10 different times, these little buttons with the icons and the text, where those values are going to change anyway, right? It's not always going to be these same top 10 searches. That will change maybe every single day. And also just want to point out a couple other areas here where we would typically use a repeating group. So here is an example of very simple list display, right? Considering and assuming that these list items are organized in your database somewhere, right? That's the whole point, right? Your repeating group is pulling from a data source. So you have to feed it some kind of a data source so that it can generate the cells for you. Another example here is on this really awesome inspiration design site, really talented designers for web designs. And just to show you just on their landing page here, we've got a couple of instances of different list designs. We have the categories in one row, but multiple columns. And I imagine that these are just the most popular categories. And then we also have this feed here of designs, and they're more in a kind of card layout where you've got the images taking up most of the content space, and you hover over and you see this text here. You've got some items there that you can interact with. All of these things you can absolutely achieve with a repeating group. I mean, they're just containers, right? And they just happen to replicate, and all the data, the dynamic data, comes from some source. Again, most popular source is going to be your database. Now, I want to go over a couple of settings that are unique to the repeating group so that you understand how to really customize interactivity with these designs. The first one is that you can change the appearance of a cell by referencing that cell specifically. And so an example of this is you'll see as I hover over each of my cells, only that group's background color is changing, and it's not happening for all of the cells. And I've done that by adding a condition to the group over here where I say this group is hovered, right? When this group is hovered, then I change the background color. My cursor can only be over one cell at a time, so it's going to evaluate this from the perspective of where your cursor is in that moment. So that's a really nice way to change the appearance settings per cell. The other thing that you have access to is the cell's data source, right? So right now the repeating group is set up to be a list of users, but I could change this to be a list of applications, companies, conversation threads, any of my other data types. And that would change that, that expression here. We would have current cells, company, or current cells, message, whatever your data type is, so that you can actually reference the data itself. So I could say something like, When the current cells user's first name is Rachel, right? I'm being more specific based off of the data, then maybe I change the background color to something else, maybe this green here. So I'm going to refresh the page. Now I have two conditions going and they can both be true at the same time. Depending on the order of my conditions, one will override the other. Okay, so we'll see here, Rachel is in green, and Rachel's always going to be in green because that condition is always true. That has nothing to do with a hover state. But I can still hover over these other ones. You'll notice that the green is taking priority. So hovering over Rachel doesn't change it to gray. But if I had moved this up, right, then the gray will take priority because it's the last condition in the list. I'm just going to show you that here. I can also combine these conditions. I can say if I'm hovering and it's Rachel, then we can make something happen. So now you see if I hover, then it changes the color there. So just keep that in mind. The order of your conditions does also matter in case you have conditions that can be true at the same time. All right, now the other data source or the other kind of state that's available to you is the current cells index. You will always have access to this regardless of what type of list you're working with. The index is just the position of the cell. So Rachel is currently in position 1, Joey is position 2, so that is index 1, index 2, index 3. Now if we had multiple columns, the index is still the position of the cell. The index has nothing to do with your rows and columns. So just to show you here that it reads from left to right, top to bottom. So this is cell 1, index 1, then 2, then 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, now that's helpful if you ever need to, keep track of, create conditions around which position number that particular data is in within the list. If you need to do math within your cells, I've worked with a lot of financial-based applications that have lots of charts and spreadsheets and running balances and things, and so those indexes can be very helpful for just knowing what item it is in the list so that you can do math with it from there. All right. Now, a couple of other just unique repeating group properties. We talked about the separator to show the line between the cells. You can change the style there, you can change the width and also the color. You also don't need to have a separator. Oftentimes you can create separation between the cells by designing your cells, with a group like this where there's very clear roundness, there's some spacing around it, you have some margins or even some drop shadows. And you have all of the same layout settings available to you like any other container. Just keep in mind that this layout setting applies to the cell, right? Just think of the cell as an individual group. So if we set an align to parent style, that means that anything inside of the cell, in this case, my group, is going to be centered or to the top or the bottom or the right or the left within those nonents of the cell. Okay, so, but it works just like any other container. And all of your other settings are the same as your other containers. You can have margins, you can make your widths and heights dynamic or fixed. So it's just a matter of getting the right combination of all these settings to come together so that you can create your list designs. All right, everyone, we'll see you in the next video.